Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jamie Bosket. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO of the Virginia Historical Society, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you, a full house this evening, to the Robbins Family Forum here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And we are just over the moon to finally, at long last, after well over a year of planning, to be able to bring you all together in this wonderful partnership with the George C. Marshall Foundation, and to have so many new friends here. As such, I would like to mention before we kick off this evening, of course, the Historical Society where you are this evening, this is the oldest cultural organization in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Founded in 1831, we've been at this longer than anyone else. In fact, we're older than older than half of the U.S. states, which is quite remarkable when you put that in perspective. The institution from that first founding in 1831 has now amassed a collection of some 9 million items to speak to the rich history of the Commonwealth and to individuals like George C. Marshall. And as we have assessed those collections and thought about our future as an institution and started to welcome even more people year after year, I think that we'd be the first to tell you that our most vibrant future is through collaboration and partnership, which is why working with great foundations like the George C. Marshall Foundation makes so much sense to bring together people who care for history and particularly what our story is here in Virginia. So I'm thrilled to have you all with us this evening, and I think it's only appropriate as we kick off as well, considering our topic, I'd like to just ask if any of our guests tonight, if you've served in the United States military, if you would just raise your hand and be recognized. Wonderful. And I would go a step further to assume we probably have a few VMI people with us this evening, right? Yeah, very good. Well, we're thrilled to have you, and it's now my great pleasure to turn it over to the collaborator this evening, Russ Fletcher, who is the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Marshall Foundation and acting president. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie, and a very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Marshall Foundation, I thank the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for hosting tonight's event. Special thanks go to, of course, you, Jamie, for all you've done, as also your able staff. I would like to also thank Graham Dozier and Andrew Talkoff as well for organizing the event, and also to Dominion Energy and its charitable foundation, headed by Hunter Applewhite, for the funding to make it all possible. So thank you all for your hospitality and generosity. For those of you unfamiliar with the George C. Marshall Foundation, we're a nonprofit organization located proudly on the post of the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. Our principal assets include a museum and a library, which possesses a global archive that includes General Marshall's papers and other valuable research materials. Our sustenance depends entirely upon private support. We receive no publicly sourced funds. And if you're not a member of the Marshall Foundation, we urge you to become one, and that can easily be done by contacting us at marshallfoundation.org. So please join. It allows us to make events such as this possible. Our lecture this evening represents a special presentation of the Foundation's Legacy Series, which draws top scholars from around the globe to discuss topics involving people, events, and policies that General Marshall influenced directly or indirectly. It's special for a couple of reasons. The first is that it is being held outside of Lexington, which is unusual, and is here instead in historic Richmond. And the second is that we are celebrating the publication of tonight's special guest's new book, the final of a monumental trilogy on FDR as Commander-in-Chief. Indeed, we are fortunate to have with us this evening leading scholar and prize-winning historian Nigel Hamilton. As an historian, Professor Hamilton comes to his profession and particularly to the period about which he is expert with an inside track. His father was the late Colonel Sir Dennis Hamilton, chairman and editor-in-chief of Times newspapers, which includes the Sunday Times, whose courageous actions and leadership as commander of the battalion stationed at the bridgehead in Nijmegen, Netherlands, during Operation Market Garden in World War II, earned him the Distinguished Service Order. As the son of one of Bernard Law Montgomery's favorites, Professor Hamilton was around the great general from an early age. In fact, Monty took him while still an undergraduate at Cambridge to Chartwell, where as a guest of Winston and Clementine Churchill, he spent one highly impressionable weekend. I can only imagine. I'll let Nigel tell that story. Professor Hamilton would go on to write a 3-volume official biography of Field Marshal Montgomery, winning the Whitbread Award in biography in 1981 and the Templar Medal for Best Contribution to Military History in 1986. His most ambitious project to date is his trilogy on how Franklin Roosevelt won World War II as U.S. Commander-in-Chief. So here we are, less than a month away from the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings, which initiated the assault phase of Operation Overlord, a masterstroke of strategy and planning, the execution of which would result in the end of war in Europe a short but brutal 11 months later. Today, little is known or remembered of the stiff British resistance to Overlord, and of the fact that the Great Invasion came very close to never taking place. Based on his new book, War and Peace, FDR's Final Odyssey, Professor Hamilton will now tell us that story and of how 2 men, President Franklin Roosevelt and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, ensured that the Great Invasion did take place, thereby hastening an end to Europe's long nightmare. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nigel Hamilton.
Thank you so much, Russ, and thank you very much for coming this evening. I've never seen so many faces in the bookstores and museums and whatever it is where I've been speaking and have yet to speak for the 75th anniversary. But I feel I don't need to introduce myself because you've told my life story. I feel I'm reaching the end of quite a long journey, really, 10 years in the making. I wrote a book called American Caesars. It was lives of the American presidents from Franklin Roosevelt through to George W. Bush. And it was modeled on a famous Roman text, the 12 Caesars by Suetonius, several thousand years ago. And it was while I was researching that book that I realized that we really know very little about FDR in his role, his constitutional role as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States. And the fact that he had been that Commander-in-Chief in the most violent war in human history, and that nobody had written a full account of that command, seemed to me wrong. And therefore, I saw little alternative but to write a small book on the subject. My publisher agreed, and this was the first volume, The Mantle of Command. I have to say, when I sent the manuscript in, my editor said, Nigel, I've read the 800 pages on my, he said, it's a terrific read, and I've reached November of 1942. Where's the rest of the war? So I said, well, please, I think this is such an extraordinary story, and it's a story which certainly nobody in my old home country knows about, but very few Americans know about. The way Franklin Roosevelt, just before the war, took a battleship to meet Winston Churchill to set down the sort of moral basis for war if the United States was attacked, was sucked into the war. That moral basis was called the Atlantic Charter, which Churchill didn't want to sign because it promised independence to British colonies in particular. But he did sign it, and the president went home with General Marshall, who was pretty astonished. Together, the president and General Marshall prepared a plan called the Victory Plan, which they finalized just before Pearl Harbor. And so the book becomes very dramatic with the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And the president realizes that meeting the objective of the American chiefs of staff, namely in the Victory Plan, namely to follow a strategy of Germany first and then Japan, because if Germany was defeated, Japan would not last very long. Well, the president realized after Pearl Harbor that was going to be quite a tough nut to crack without much of a navy left, and with very few soldiers either. So the president set about recasting not so much the overall grand strategy of the war, which did involve Germany first, but how to get there. And he decided, he overrode General Marshall's advice and decided that instead of launching a cross-channel D-Day type invasion in 1942, before American soldiers had any combat experience in modern warfare, American forces would land in North Africa. And I have to say, General Marshall was dead against it. And the Secretary of War, Henry Marshall, bet the President of the United States that it would fail. Well, it didn't fail. Here they are on their battleships, the President and Winston Churchill, signing the Atlantic Charter. And here's what happened in November of 1942 when American forces landed in North Africa. Operation Torch, an extraordinary success which established the United States in combat in North Africa. And so the second volume, which I assured my publisher would be the last, took up the story at the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943, when the president travels, again, the book begins with a voyage, when the president travels for the first time, a president flies in office on a flying boat to Casablanca. And what does he do there? He visits his commanders in the field, General Eisenhower, General Mark Clark, George Patton, but also Winston Churchill once again, because he wants to set a new policy for the United States once major American forces meet the Wehrmacht in battle, and that is a policy of unconditional surrender. No negotiation with the Nazis. This is absolute, modern, total war. The Germans had already exterminated perhaps 2 million Jews by then. No negotiation with these bastards, excuse my language. And there he is making the announcement. Again, Churchill rather uncertain about this, but went along with it. And so the president leaves Casablanca, having had long talks with General Eisenhower, is quite certain that the United States needs to stay long enough in the Mediterranean to engage in combat with the Wehrmacht, with Rommel and other senior German generals, and prove itself on the modern battlefield, using especially modern air power, but also naval help. And so he is delighted when only, whatever it is, 3-4 months later, in May of 1943, an entire German and Italian army, the Axis army in North Africa, the entire army surrenders unconditionally, as the president had laid down, to General Eisenhower. And shortly after that, American forces, together with British and Canadians, land in Sicily, and then conquer Sicily in a few weeks, and continue with an amphibious landing in southern Italy. So the story of 1943 is one of a monumental learning process for the armed forces of the United States in modern warfare. And not just troops, but we're talking about commanders, those who failed in battle and were sent home, and those who succeeded, like General George Patton. There is only one problem. Winston Churchill, during this period, and that explains partly the subtitle for that. Do you see it? FDR's battle with Churchill. Because Churchill was delighted by having American forces in the Mediterranean. A British army was victorious at the Battle of Alamein under Field Marshal Montgomery, and helped to crush the German forces between the British army coming from the east and American forces coming through from Tunisia in the west. So Churchill was delighted to have American forces in the Mediterranean, but hated the idea of D-Day, of an amphibious invasion across the English Channel. After all, nobody had successfully launched a military invasion across the English Channel since William the Conqueror in 1066. And Duke William's was his second attempt. Even Hitler hadn't dared do it in the summer of 1940. It wasn't simply Winston Churchill's brave rhetoric in the summer, his finest hour, that stopped the Germans. And it wasn't only the Battle of Britain in the skies above England. It was the fact that that is a huge body of water, and a nasty body of water. So Winston Churchill came twice to the United States in 1943 to plead with the American president and commander-in-chief of the American forces to dump the notion of D-Day. He foresaw an English Channel running in blood. And to some degree, he was being perfectly reasonable in fearing what might happen if we moved ahead with that project. The British did mount a little sort of mini mini D-Day at a place called Dieppe in the summer of 1942. It was a catastrophe. 1,000 Canadians were killed in the first 3 hours. Killed, that's not the casualties, the wounded. Most of them were captured and spent the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps. But so clearly Churchill was right to fear the inevitable casualties in a cross-channel invasion that had not taken place in 1,000 years. But the President and General Marshall were both clear that the only way to defeat the Wehrmacht and force the Third Reich to surrender was by crossing the English Channel and creating a second front. Couldn't be done. Frigging about in the southern or eastern Mediterranean would leave Hitler master of Europe, and the killing would go on. It had to be done. So the third volume picks up in November of 1943, as the President of the United States once again boards a battleship, crosses the Atlantic, to meet with Winston Churchill. Churchill has, despite his objections to the D-Day plan, despite all his predictions of doom and whatever, Churchill has actually signed up to the project in Quebec in the summer of 43. But and the project is set to be mounted, to be launched, first thing in the spring of 1944, the 1st of May, 1944. Churchill has signed up to that agreement, but the President has heard, as he sets off to North Africa to meet with Churchill. Here's the USS Iowa, the latest American battleship at the time. The President has heard from his spies, his informants, that Churchill is on the warpath and not against Hitler, but against the President of the United States. Churchill is also on a battleship. I haven't got a picture of it here, but he is on HMS Renown, heading for the same place. They're going to meet at the beginning of this final volume. They're going to meet in Cairo. And on board his battleship, Winston Churchill, who is a master of English writing and English rhetoric, is penning an indictment of the President's strategy, claiming it's all wrong and that the Quebec Agreement that he'd signed up to was simply a lawyer's agreement. And as we know, lawyers' agreements can be torn up. Winston says to one of his advisors, whom he meets at Malta in the Mediterranean on his way to Cairo, he says, this is going to be a turning point in World War II. He says, this showdown I'm going to have with the President is going to change history. He was determined that the D-Day plan should be shelved, delayed, abandoned. And FDR knows this. He has sat down, here's a photo of him on board the ship with his White House Chief of Staff, Admiral Leahy, with Admiral King, who was head of the United States Navy, and George Marshall. And we have the minutes of their conversations, partial minutes of their conversations in which they wring their hands at the thought that after all this learning process in the Mediterranean, how to defeat the Wehrmacht, all this process of learning in modern battle, the defeats they faced at Kasserine, for instance, in February of 1943, after all they've gone through, with these battle-hardened American forces and airmen, Winston isn't going to go through with it. And they're all aware that they need to succeed in an amphibious invasion of, whether it's the Pas-de-Calais or the Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy, wherever they land in northern France. This is going to be one of the great battles of history. And if the Brits basically chicken out, there's no way that the United States can really mount the invasion. In fact, General Marshall, in the discussions they have on board the battleship, says, well, perhaps we should just turn our attention to the Pacific. And the president says, no. We can't leave Hitler master of Europe, not when it's our whole war strategy is based on Germany first. And ironically, at the same time, we know from these diaries that I've been able to assemble that Winston Churchill is saying the same thing. If we just refuse to do it, the Americans will be forced to turn to the Pacific. It is a pretty extraordinary development. It's probably the most critical moment in the history of World War II, and how many people in this audience know of it? Probably not a lot. It is almost a scandal to me in terms of historiography. And people often ask me, well, if so, how come we didn't know about this? Well, there are several reasons. One is that the president dies in 1945. He's been assembling his papers. He wants to write the story of World War II from his perspective. I was able to interview the last surviving senior officer in the map room at the White House, which was the point at which all top signals, communications came from Stalin, Churchill, Chiang Kai-shek, all came in, went out, but also the most high-level intelligence and military communications. I was able to interview him. And he had, I don't know if I can say this here, he'd been to Harvard. He was a young graduate student from Harvard, and his professor was working in American intelligence in Washington. And so gradually he recommended him. So this Lieutenant Commander Elsie was posted to the map room. And there was the Lieutenant Commander Elsie began to assemble FDR's wartime papers with the president, ready to write his memoirs. But the president, we may have time to talk a little bit about the second part of the book, which covers the president's fatal illness. But it's one of the tragedies for a historian that FDR was not able to write his own account of the war. And, of course, Winston Churchill, who was almost 10 years older than the president, did survive the war, was the most wonderful writer and proceeded to write not just 3 volumes like, some of us, but wrote 6 volumes of memoirs of how he had won World War II, which he called the Second World War. And for that, Winston Churchill rightly won, in my view, the Nobel Prize for Literature. It is an absolute masterwork. He had left 10 Downing Street when he lost office in 1945. He was able to take all his secret government papers with him and had an army of helpers, people who'd been working under him in the government and who helped sort of collate everything. It is a masterly series of books. But it does present Winston very much as the chief architect and director of strategy of World War II. And, you know, I think perhaps a little sadly, I mean, those people who write memoirs understandably want to put the best, give the best impression of their achievements. That's perfectly understandable. What is less understandable is why historians have gone on simply accepting Winston Churchill's view of the war, which basically was that the President of the United States was really just like a very generous uncle. And I have to say, I began these books with, I think, a pretty open mind. I had, as Russ said, I had stayed as a young student with Winston Churchill and Clemmy and two of their daughters. I admired Winston Churchill. I loved his writing. But I had become a military historian, and I simply couldn't I couldn't accept without question Winston Churchill's account of the war. So, as I explained earlier, I thought I would write this little book. The little book became a bit bigger and bigger book and led to a completely new view, I think, of World War II, of the way that FDR directed not only the strategy, the military strategy of World War II, but at every level, at every moment, at every interval, would set the sort of moral basis for fighting the war and for what should follow the war. So we only have limited time this evening, but the book covers the high point. The first half of the book is the story of how the president meets with General Eisenhower in North Africa, in Iran, and then in Tunis, and talks to him about Winston Churchill. There's the president's plane, the sacred cow. And the president, having spoken to Eisenhower, having not only spoken with Eisenhower, but having listened to Eisenhower, having listened to some of Eisenhower's, not only his senior officers, there's Eisenhower with his chief of staff, but also with some young officers there, to get a kind of first-hand impression of how Americans in the combat zone in North Africa felt about the war. So the president arrives in Cairo, ready for the showdown. Churchill calls it an indictment, and the Churchill says to one of his advisors, "I feel like a man who has one hand tied behind his back because of American stupidity." He feels that the United States should go on supporting the British in the Mediterranean, that the British should attack the Greek islands, the Dodecanese Islands, Rhodes, should try and force the Dardanelles, which he'd tried to do in World War I and hadn't been very successful. That they should try and go into the Balkans when American forces were still barely beyond Naples. Those of you who've been to Italy know it's no mean territory to campaign in. Even the Romans found it pretty tough. Rome, Rhodes, the Dardanelles, the Crimea, anywhere but D-Day. You know, it's one of those things that has really been swept under the proverbial rug. How opposed, how determined Winston Churchill was at this moment in late November 1943 to stop D-Day. And the miracle is, and I can't unfortunately tell you the whole story this evening, but I have been able to, it's part of the reason it took me 10 years. I have been able to follow this story, to document the story, and to tell a truly extraordinary story about an American president who, with the help of his Army Chief of Staff, faced Winston Churchill in Cairo and forced Churchill to back down. And the two men, FDR and Churchill, fly to Tehran. The president has refused to cancel or delay D-Day. He's insisted upon it. He arrives in Tehran, here he is. He's at the top of his form. He's never felt better. He goes into the summit with Stalin, and Stalin says, well, thank you, Mr. President. If you are really going to carry out D-Day in the spring of 1944, we Russians will launch a simultaneous offensive on the Eastern Front involving over 1 million men, Operation Bagration, and we will crush the German Wehrmacht between us. Not only that, Mr. President, we will also, once Germany surrenders unconditionally, we will join you in your war with Japan, because Russia was still neutral in that. And we will send perhaps an army of 1 million men to help you into Manchuria. So from the president's point of view, this is all he ever dreamed of. As an outcome, he's full of beans. You can see him laughing there. Churchill less pleased. In fact, Churchill is on record saying to his doctor after the first night at Tehran, the doctor said, well, Prime Minister, has anything gone wrong? And Churchill says, a bloody lot has gone wrong. But nobly, he accepts 2 against 1, and he signs, well, he had already signed that, but he agrees that British forces will participate at least 50% on D-Day. And the president and Churchill go back to Cairo, and there the president finally appoints not General Marshall, but General Eisenhower to be the supreme commander of D-Day. Now, that in itself is an extremely interesting story, which I don't think any historian has ever really told, how the president decided against Marshall. And I would just briefly, it's in the book, but I would briefly explain my view, which is that the president never intended Marshall to go to Europe. He needed him in Washington. He was the most brilliant Army Chief of Staff who'd ever been in office. He was not only a superb administrator, but he was able to meet members of Congress and the Senate and explain, often in secret session, the reasons why so much money was being spent or why various decisions were being made. And the president couldn't see anybody, the president, in fact, who was always, he never did anything without testing the waters, so to speak. He contacted General Pershing from the First World War and said, General, do you think, what do you advise? And Pershing sent him a wonderful letter, which I've quoted in the book, saying, don't let Marshall go to Europe. He's too big for that. The British will force him to, the British are determined to go on in the Mediterranean, and we can't have General Marshall just stuck in a backwater. So the president, who, as we saw, has visited with Eisenhower at Tunis, they've spent a whole day together touring the battlefields. The president is quite confident in sending a message to Marshal Stalin to say that a supreme commander for Overlord has been decided. He has decided it. He sends the message to General Eisenhower, but then gets on the sacred cow and flies to Tunis to tell Eisenhower in person. That's the kind of president FDR was. There he is, again, looking $1 million. Eisenhower, of course, delighted behind him. And the president even takes General Eisenhower on his plane to Malta and to Sicily. He really wants to go to Italy, but General Eisenhower, who's still commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean, Allied commander-in-chief, says, no, Mr. President, that could be a little dangerous at this point. But they go to Sicily. The president awards the Distinguished Service Medal to General Mark Clark. And do you see the character behind Eisenhower in the top right? Do we have a laser? Yes, we do. George Patton, yes. George Patton was, his career was rather under a cloud. He'd slapped 2 American soldiers in a field hospital. There had been a scandal about it. He'd lost his command in Sicily, and the president asked him to come up behind the jeep and said, George, you will command an army in the D-Day invasion. So this is the president we're talking about, which so many people don't recognize. I think probably the most effective American strategist in American history, when you think of the global war he was directing, which I think has gone largely unchronicled and undervalued. There he is about to go home. I think that is Patton in the back there. And Mark Clark, who was decorated for his bravery at Salerno. And the president returns on the USS Iowa back to America. He's greeted by members of the administration and Congress as a conquering hero. He goes to Hyde Park. He spends Christmas in Hyde Park. It was 1943. D-Day is set for 5 months' time. With his grandchildren, he makes a famous broadcast to announce his appointment of General Eisenhower to be the supreme commander of the great attack. And then falls ill. At first, people think it's just flu. He can't give his normal State of the Union address. It has to be broadcast. He never gets better. By the spring of 1944, just before D-Day. He is so ill that his daughter manages to get Admiral McIntyre, his White House physician, to call in consultants. And thank God, a young American cardiologist, Dr. Brune, who was in the Navy, diagnosed fatal heart disease and insisted that the president be given this highly toxic medication, digitalis, saves the president's life. We'll come back to Mr. Churchill here. And the president, I mean, this is somewhat... I've seen this photograph given as June of 1944, but I don't believe it. I mean, he looks too well there. But this is his famous D-Day Prayer, which apparently was heard by over 100 million people across the world. Really beautiful prayer. Goebbels, of course, who was not religious, thought it an insult to Christianity. But D-Day goes ahead, 6th of June. My father had been evacuated as a second lieutenant at Dunkirk. He went back on D-Day as a 25-year-old acting lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion of 1,000 men on the British beaches. 600 of them became casualties in the Battle of Normandy. But Hitler had predicted to his generals that D-Day would be the, and I'm quoting, the deciding battle of World War II. That's what we should never forget. It's not just an invasion. It's the critical moment of World War II, certainly in Europe. And it is an amazing test of courage and willpower and, thanks to General Marshall, logistical brilliance. It does decide the war. And as Russ said, 11 months later, the Allies can celebrate VE Day. But by then, the president's health has continued to deteriorate. Of course, he should never have stood for a fourth term. I tell the story in the book. He didn't want to. He was so ill, he could only concentrate for 1 or 2 hours a day. How he took a battleship to Pearl Harbor to try and knock heads together between General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz, who were basically not really talking to one another. General MacArthur had refused ever to visit Pearl Harbor, ever, even though the president had rescued him from the Philippines. He sat in Australia and the islands, and the president, you see, the big thing about being president and commander-in-chief is when the president sends a signal saying, General MacArthur, be in Pearl Harbor on August 25. On my arrival, MacArthur finally, for the first time, went to Hawaii. But it is a dying president. MacArthur says to one of his staff officers that the president has 6 months to live, and he was pretty accurate in that. And yet again, after he's won the election, more or less dying on his feet, he goes on another battleship back to the Mediterranean and then flying to Yalta. And failing, yes, to achieve all his ideals, his ideal program, and certainly in terms of helping Poland, but getting the things that he felt were really important, getting the Russians to sign up to the things he felt really important, including the United Nations Security Council, some notion of the zones of occupation in Germany. and coming home so ill that when he reported to Congress in March of 1945, he could not stand. He'd always had these metal braces that were just firm enough for him to be able to at least stand at a podium and hang on. He can't even do that. And a few weeks later, he departs from West Warm Springs, where I was yesterday, and it's there that he dies on the 12th of April, 1945. Should I read a couple of lines? Yes, no? Yes. Injections of papaverine, nitroglycerin, and amyl nitrate were administered by Dr. Brune, for the president's heart, paradoxically, was still pumping. He'd fallen forwards at his desk and complaining of a big, terrible headache. He'd been carried to bed. The lady who was painting his portrait, Elizabeth Shumatov, shouted, screamed, "Call a doctor!" They fetched Dr. Brune from down the bottom of the hill at Warm Springs, who was in the swimming baths. Comes up, he gives him these medications. But the president had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage or catastrophic stroke. His blood pressure was 300/190. There was nothing, despite attempted artificial respiration by the president's masseur, that could be done except to wait for the end. In the event, the siege did not last long. Lucy Rutherford, his friend who'd become a widow from earlier, recognizing she was with Elizabeth, recognizing immediately the end was approaching, told Elizabeth Shumatov to pack her easel and bags and summon the photographer Nicholas Robbins. There is a photograph of the president looking so deathly ill, which is by Nicholas Robbins, I have in the book. In the white Cadillac in which they'd come, they set off from the estate, Warm Springs, before the press could arrive. They would only hear whether or not the president had actually passed away when they stopped to telephone the little White House on their journey home. The flag at Macon, Georgia, was already at half-mast. The operator, before putting the call through, asked if they knew what had become national, in fact global, news at 3:35 p.m. local time, April the 12th, 1945. The commander-in-chief was dead. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take a couple of quick questions. Please, nobody say, I have two questions.
Dr. Hamilton, could you say...
I think they'll give you a microphone, then other people can hear your question.
Thank you. Could you tell us why you think it took 70-plus years for the story of FDR's prominence to come out?
I think the main reason is that Winston Churchill was such a fabulous writer. And as a historian, I can only feel, I don't feel envious because I so admire Churchill's prose. I think also the fact that Britain, at the beginning of the war, is, one of the great democracies, but not just one of the great democracies, but it's an empire. It is the British Empire. By the end of the war, it's almost already a has-been. And so the figure of Winston Churchill becomes tremendously symbolically important in terms of sort of nostalgia, that he represented Britain not just at his finest hour, Churchill's, but at Britain's finest hour. And so I think between British historians, even to this day, claiming, Andrew Roberts, who's a fine writer and so forth, claimed in a book that he wrote a few months ago that it is quite quite untrue that Churchill had in any way sought to delay D-Day, as has been alleged. Well, I mean, I'm going to send him all 3 volumes. Sorry, Graham, I can't.
I was wondering at the Tehran conference, was there any indication at the Tehran conference that Stalin was going to slack off on his Eastern Front offensives if Churchill and Roosevelt didn't open a Western Front offensive?
He never threatened it. It was just that it was quite clear that the Russians could not defeat Hitler on their own. And if Churchill had truly backed out and just insisted on continuing in the Mediterranean, and if American forces had, as General Marshall felt was the only alternative, had moved, turned their priority to the Pacific, I think most historians would agree that Stalin would have come to some negotiated settlement with Hitler. I mean, this really was the critical moment of the entire war, and it is amazing how many writers and historians pick on little things that happened at Tehran to little anecdotes or so forth without recognizing just what a cardinal moment in modern history this was. I was even alive. Admittedly, I was 1 year old. But
Thank you so much.
Well.